Hello everybody and welcome to Mapping Global China Conversations. I'm Maria Dele Carrai and I'm an assistant professor in Global China Studies at NYU Shanghai. And today we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Andrea Ghiselli, who's a lecturer in international politics at the University of Exeter, with expertise in China foreign policy, in particular the engagement of China in the Middle East. And he spent 9 years in Shanghai, here in Fudan, and he just recently moved to the UK. He also serves as head of research for the ChinaMed Project at the Two China Hub, where he closely tracks China's geopolitical strategies and partnership in the wider Mediterranean and Middle East region. Dr. Ghiselli works critically examines how China navigates regional instability, balances diplomatic and economic interests, and increasingly securitizes its overseas footprint. And his last book was precisely on China, kind of global securitization of its interest. His research on China's relationship with Iran, its cautious role amid regional rivalries, and the expanding scope of non-traditional security issues provide very valuable insights into how Beijing's adapting its foreign policy in response to the Middle East shifting dynamics. And I think with the new Trump administration, there is a lot of shifting dynamics everywhere in the world, not just the Middle East. So thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
And so I would like to start with a broader question on how would you characterize China's current approach in the Middle East, particularly in light of the ongoing conflicts involving Israel, Iran, and the broader US regional interests?
I like to describe the Middle East. I mean, when it comes to describing the Middle East and North Africa, but especially the Middle East, in its position in China's foreign policy, I always like to think that the Middle East is the most important among the least important regions. In the sense that it's peripheral, of course, to China, because, of course, the Taiwan issue is still unresolved. There are still maritime issues, maritime disputes in the East and the South China Sea. So that, of course, cannot but absorb political, diplomatic, economic, military energy from Beijing. Right? There's also the main theater of confrontation with the United States for obvious reasons. And so the Middle East, of course, cannot compete with East Asia or Southeast Asia. That said, in the Middle East, there's a lot of things going on that, in a way, command attention from Beijing, right? You have, of course, the war in Gaza is just the latest example of course, a series of conflicts that have been taking place there since, well, for a long time, right? Which, of course, usually involve the intervention of the Security Council, of which China is a permanent member. So indirectly, the Middle East is a place through which China can fully leverage its position as permanent member of the UNC and can discuss and put forward its ideas about issues such as sovereignty and intervention, right? The Middle East has long been an important market for Chinese infrastructure engineering constructor and increasingly also for more advanced companies like in the EV or nuclear sector, right? Nuclear energy sector, data cloud, and so on. And then you have energy, of course. In November, there was a report by Sinopec, I believe, saying that China is close to the peak of its energy imports from abroad. But yet, that doesn't mean that China will suddenly become energy independent. And the Middle East, the Gulf in particular, will remain a critical source of energy for a long time. And last but not least, of course, there is the issue of the Uyghurs and Islam more broadly, right? And so China has to keep an eye on what's going on. First it was Turkey, now it's Syria, right? Where Uyghurs have been integrated into the ranks of the national army in Syria. And so there are many things, none of which alone really undermines or challenges China's so-called core interests, right? The essentially regime security, territorial integrity, and its economic development. And nothing really alone can do that. Yet, all together, especially as a lot of things can go wrong very quickly, right? Regimes look very stable until they're not. In the region, also in the United States, we see that, right? Everything was about rule-based order, international order. Now, maybe not so. So many things can change. China needs to focus on that. But of course, doing that requires trades-off. China has to focus on many other regions. And so, again, going back to the original question, where is the Middle East? The Middle East is there, right? China has to pay attention to it. It had to do it before Trump, before Gaza, and so on. And I think, in a way, Chinese policymakers maybe until very recently, before the Trump's arrival, they had, and we could see that's right in how China was essentially scoring diplomatic points, essentially with its well, again, there is a debate on this, but generally speaking, pro-Palestinian positions, essentially criticizing the United States. So it seemed that there was an increased focus of Chinese foreign policy makers on the Middle East that gave it a certain continuity and a certain, I think, effectiveness. Now, of course, with Trump's arrival, probably the Middle East's importance has declined in comparison with all what's going on.
Thank you. And so China, I think, approach its relations with the Middle East has been characterized by this balanced diplomacy. And do you think with what's happening, escalating tensions, as you mentioned, war, Palestine, Israel, Trump coming in, like how this diplomatic balancing can continue, can be sustained? Was it sustainable before? Was it actually really a balanced diplomacy? How was perceived? What's your take on that?
I think the last point is the most valid one, that can a diplomatic strategy really be balanced? If you ask the Israeli, China's approach to Iran was never balanced. For example, if you ask the Israeli today what they think about China's approach to the Palestinian issue, is not balanced. There are also some Palestinian scholars that think that actually, for example, China's position is implicitly a pro-Israeli one. So it's very difficult to tell what's balanced and what's not. Definitely, that said, of course, not to make everything about relativism, I think especially over time, China has tried its best and sometimes has succeeded in not making enemies at the very least. So maybe not making everyone happy, but also not make anyone unhappy. But I think today, especially since the beginning of the war in Gaza, since October 7th, I think there has been, well, already before actually, let me correct, already before with the Abraham Accords and the Trump first, and now with Gaza, I think it is increasingly clear that at least in certain situations, China made the decision, like, I'm going to sacrifice the relations with someone in order to preserve certain interests in the region. In the case of the Abraham Accords, China, for example, has always been happy with the idea of rapprochement between Arabs and Israel. But, for example, it has always opposed the idea that that should result in Iranian isolation, right? So that was very clear. So they oppose it on this ground to some extent. In the case of the war in Gaza, I think they simply decide at this moment in time in the region, and when you look at global public opinion, it's simply there's more to be gained by making statements in favor of Palestinians, even if that angers the Israeli at the moment. Of course, this doesn't mean they're ready to give up on the relations with Israel, and probably Israel is not ready to give up on the relations with China. But again, they think they increasingly, if you want to go back in time, you can also look at, for example, the vetoes they casted at the Security Council over Syria, right? They do their best to preserve a balance, but as at times, increasingly so, especially you can say maybe since Xi Jinping's arrival, maybe it's very difficult to pinpoint the role of leaders in that. But at the point they made it quite clear, or we can say it's quite clear that they made the decision about pros and cons of certain positions, and maybe they're ready to be a bit less balanced. Not completely unbalanced, but a bit less balanced. Of course, with the idea that let's see how things play out, and today, most of the time, these are short-term costs in relations with Israel or with Gulf countries when it came to Syria a long time ago, right? And things can, in any case, be recovered later on. After all, China remains a permanent member of the Security Council. Most of the countries in the region are dependent on it. And so no one really can afford to be an enemy.
And do you think less balanced means more assertive?
No.
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 Okay. Okay. And do you see China, because I think one of the characteristics of China is kind of when it goes abroad or like when it deploys some of its militaries abroad is through United Nations. And so it's not like the US, right? So would you see this changing in the future, China deploying military in support of particular country? I've read, I don't know whether it's true, that there were some Chinese combat in the supporting Russia against Ukraine.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think these were civilians that just decided to.
They were citizens.
Citizens.
Who knows exactly?
Citizens, nationals.
Yes.
So that might be, I don't know, a first step toward broader involvement.
Yeah. Well, there was the famous volunteer army in Korea, so you can have something like that. But no, I think, no, and this is why I say, I think maybe you can see more episodes, it's more like to see more episodes of unbalanced Chinese approach to different countries, but not necessarily assertive, at least outside East Asia. Reason being that China, as again, because of its position in the Security Council and its economy, actually can do a lot without really making big investments. Make statements, invite people to come, but doesn't really need to put boots on the ground, right? Doesn't need, to make a splash. China does not need to make big, such kind of investments. And this also, of course, allows it to preserve a certain degree of flexibility. Yes, today they make these statements, but tomorrow they can change, right? They're just statements at the end of the day. And building on that, if you asked me maybe a few years ago, I would have thought that there was a possibility of a larger Chinese military footprint, maybe in the region. Today, I'm much more skeptical for a number of reasons. I think there's a kind of demand and supply change that happened. There's less reasons, there are fewer reasons for really China to deploy troops.
Interesting, because I think now also with the current new administration, US potentially withdrawing, and so I think from many commentaries we see, now this is a golden occasion of China to jump in and assert how responsible it is as a great power, so to come and help friends. So I think this will be potentially a good opportunity for China to deploy some of its people abroad, but it's interesting that you don't think so.
No, and the reason is that, so again, on the one hand, there is the demand side story, right? Most of Chinese nationals today in the Middle East are concentrated in very few stable countries in the Gulf, most of them. There was a huge community in Algeria that has been declining as far as the official data can tell us, so there's less to be protected. I mean, well, of course, there are assets, economic assets. You can also talk about the Red Sea, Strait of Hormuz, and all of that. But I think China can absorb part of those economic costs, and so it can also, in a way, wait and see. And when it comes, maybe, yes, if there is a UN-sponsored something, maybe. But otherwise, I don't see really many reasons, really. I don't think there's such a demand for, even if American troops leave, I think very few countries in the region think, okay, then we need the Chinese to come in. And then there is, of course, the supply side. Yes, China's been modernizing its military and all of that, but especially because of tensions with the United States, I think it just doesn't make that much sense for China to appear like actually seizing on such kind of opportunities. One thing is you criticize the United States for their pro-Israeli stance. Another thing is you go in with troops, something that is very likely to trigger a blowback, right? It's gonna fire back in your face. And again, then the real point is what to be gained by deploying troops. In China, there's so many things that it is other instruments, law enforcement, right? Isa Cardon and Sheena Grittens, have published a couple of articles showing that law enforcement cooperation, for example, is something that is much more demand. China has much more capability and expertise, and is far less likely to backfire, right?
Can you tell us a bit more about the law enforcement mechanism with the countries? Because I think, for instance, if we look at the recent case, like the scandals with Telegram that was used by Walls and
Signal.
Yeah, Signal. And so it was about kind of shooting down some Houthis, right?
Yes.
That they're pirates, basically, right?
Yeah.
That threaten trade that goes to Europe. And so these are kind of important choke points also that is in the interest of China to protect.
Yes.
And so if the US is no longer there, and we follow J.D. Vance, why do we have to,
well, it might not be there.
Yeah.
They are there at the moment.
At the moment. But if they're not there in the future, you think there's still no need for China coming in? Maybe that could be a good way for China to kind of assert itself, right? And establish a new partnership with Europe that cannot look toward west, it has to look east.
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility, right? Although voices of American declining military presence in the region have been going on for a long time, as a matter of fact, that has not really happened. And so let's see even what happens with this administration. Again, then the second question, I'm not saying that Chinese policymakers are necessarily smarter than those of other countries, but I think if there is a lessons to be learned from all these American and Western deployments and use of military force in the Middle East and North Africa, is that they actually don't work that much. So there's also another thing, for Chinese policymakers, they're so cautious, right, about the risks and the uncertainties that something like this might bring about. I think also for them is like, why should we do this, right? And even if we do it, what has to be gained? Once again, like, I don't think, I'm not saying that they have a better options or that they will not succumb to hubris. Maybe they will. But I wouldn't think that that's an automatic, like one power goes and another one comes in. Especially because in the region there's no, maybe there might be appetite, maybe. And again, this is all to be actually seen in practice. There might be appetite for an end of American power in the region. And again, many people don't want it actually. But the fact that there is this, the people might know what they don't want, doesn't mean that they also want China. They want an alternative, right?
But also, we don't know whether China wants to be that kind of alternative. Right? There are other ways in which you can be present. There's a lot of failure. And also, I think history. I think we are where we are today because of specific historical events that took place and what we see today, like the kind of military alliances, America being in hegemony, is really the fruit of a particular historical situations, right? And so maybe China would be moving away, like, you know, we're entering probably already this multipolar world order.
You know,
and
I'm with a good friend of mine, Mohammed Al-Sudairi. We have this book in production with Cambridge University Press on China and the Middle East, where we kind of look at how Chinese, Saudi and Syrian elites have been talking about China's role in the region. And one of the things that stand out in the Chinese debate is that they know they have to do something, but they do not know what they have to do. There's this very clear consensus that something has to change, but then exactly what, how, even when is not clear at all. So again, on both sides, from China, but also from Indian perspective, in a way, the most likely outcome, at least this is what Mohammed, I think, is that actually will not change much. They know what they don't want, but they don't know what they want. The result is that, you know,
inertia.
Until
something.
Some kind of multipolar regional order. China, of course, will be important, will be influential, but not really big change.
Yeah. So I think we really have to go through a paradigmatic shift in the way potentially we see order, military, kind of power projection and hegemony and so forth. So, I mean, you're working on a book on Saudi.
We look at the narratives emerging from Chinese, Saudi, and Syrian, pre-Assad Syrian intellectual and journalistic elites on how they look at China's role in the region. Can you
tell us a bit more about like how China is seen in the Middle East? I mean, what are the general perceptions among different actors? So it's well perceived, it's seen as a threat, as a savior.
Well, it's of course always very difficult to extrapolate findings from even from a few well-selected cases into a region-wide kind of explanation, right? Especially because this book was designed to be short, so we only could choose China plus 2 cases. But our impression essentially is that our sense of where things are going, that all those countries, a bit like Saudi Arabia, but you might include the UAE, for example, Turkey, Egypt, possibly, right, that have the capacity in a way, they can be considered kind of regional powers. They're very happy to engage with China. They see actually that engagement is necessary to achieve their own goals, which a lot of times somewhat overlap in this, they kind of converge over economic development. So this is what China wants, right? Because it's a kind of win-win kind of proposition. But they're very happy to just look at China as an economic diplomatic partner, but not more than that. So China is an instrument, is an important instrument. It's a necessary instrument, but it's not more than that, right? And then you have other countries like, look, pre-Assad Syria, or in a way you can put Israel in a way in that context, that have very unbalanced relations with the current hegemon, the United States, which in a way automatically limits the intensity, the kind of relations they can have with China. Like in the case of Israel, there is this, obviously, the partnership with the United States. In the case of Syria, instead, you have a country that the pre-Assad Syria again, I have to clarify. They had a completely opposite relation. They look at China instead as a savior pretty much. But because of the lack of capacity, economic, military, diplomatic weight, they basically had no real way to engage with China. And so the real players who matter at the end of the day are those that are rich, they have a functioning state machine, but they also, and they want to engage with China, but also very happy to see a truly multipolar regional order emerge. So they will ensure to keep China in the game, but they also probably will ensure that the United States remain in the game. And so to leverage this kind of relations as much as possible.
Thank you. So we talked about all these different actors in the Middle East. Iran. What about Iran? I mean, because I think, I don't know whether he would be open to U.S. presence in the region. I think it's a very particular, and so I wanted to ask you how China's strategic partnership with Iran evolved in recent years and how credible is the long-term cooperation promised in the 25-year deal signed in 2021.
Iran is an interesting case, right? Because it's a relatively rich country, but at the same time has this, of course, terrible relations with Washington since basically the establishment of the Islamic Republic. And so that means that it must engage with China, but has also limited leverage. Now it does. I mean, Iran is very dependent on China. And this it can be seen especially, and this is not in the book because again, we don't cover Iran, but it's part of the work we do at ChinaMed. We look at the Iranian press very often. And it's quite clear that this creates unease in China as well as in Iran. In China, you can see people that see, of course, Iran as an important partner, but they also would like Iran to change. They're fine to have an anti-American Iran, but not a pariah state. They don't want a rogue state. They don't want a rogue Iran, right? And so they would like an Iran that, for example, focuses on economic development at home rather than the nuclear program, for example. And this become, especially with the fall of Assad in Syria, there is a full awareness in China, like everywhere else, that Iran is particularly weak. And the so-called ring of fire around Israel has crumbled. And so you can see in Chinese media, for example, very strong calls for change in Iran, not change in terms of regime change, but change in the focus of policy. Iran should focus on build its economic, power, societal reform, and so far and so on. And then in Iran, you see the other side of this debate in which they say, some people say we must get closer to China. This is usually the conservative side of the debate. China and Russia usually are together on this. We should look east, right? Because the Europeans are basically too slow or too much closely aligned with the Americans. The United States are there essentially to get us. But then there are also others that say we're also overly dependent on China, like too much discount on oil, for example. Chinese goods, we're too much dependent on Chinese goods. Also some, and this was some of the things we found out recently, also some people say, we should actually have dialogue with the United States because the truth is neither China nor Russia are interested to ensure that things move because that's a way for them to leverage our problems vis-a-vis the United States. They're not there to solve our problems. And so we should rather have direct communication with the Trump administration. So in a way, the two are bound together because of the sanctions on one side. On the other hand, there's the United States. Definitely it's parts of, you can imagine, the Chinese party state and parts of the Iranian theocratic state are very close to each other. You can think about the energy relations, the military relations. But other parts think in different ways. And so we had a very short moment after the JCPOA in which the first thing the Iranian did was go into Europe and buy stuff and try to repair the relations with Europe. And people in China got the message immediately. They thought, it's good that JCPOA is on because this also ease the pressure on us to kind of be those that have to deal with Iran. But at the same time, it also means the Iranians have more space for their own diplomacy and economic relations, which might come to our detriment. I mean, there's no expectation that whatever negotiations, if they're successful with the United States, will turn Iran into a liberal democracy aligned with Washington or with Europe. But still, for the moment, in a way, they're stuck together. And it's fine, but also there are tensions.
I think it's similar with Russia, probably, right? They're stuck together.
Yes. Absolutely. Although probably I think, again, this is pure speculation, but There's some people, I think, in foreign affairs recently or in other outlets have been talking about an axis of losers, right? Is Iran, Russia, North Korea, and then there is China, which is actually not a loser. But as Russia, North Korea, and Iran increasingly coordinate and work with each other, essentially Russia has increasingly become more similar in economic terms to not to North Korea but to Iran because of sanctions and so on. They've been, providing troops and missiles to each other. There are also questions of what it means for China, right? Right? Does it increase China's influence around the world, being so part of something that increasingly looks like a bloc, or maybe not? Because these are not powerful countries.
What do you think? What are your thoughts?
My thought is that it's a liability, and people in China might see the liability in this. At the same time, there's always, if one goes for counterfactual, is what choice really is there for China? Should they just give up on these three countries? They could, but probably the result would be even more complete isolations.
I don't think they can, especially Russia or North Korea. They're really very close geographical proximity as well.
They would gain some approval from Europeans and the Americans,
the European change their minds,
exactly.
Right? And
so it's in a way it's a bit of a catch 22, right?
Yeah. So the last question, thanks for this, what, in your view, regional developments, like potential Iran-Israel confrontations, U.S. disengagement with the region, and shifting alliances, how will this development might affect the trajectory of China's role in Middle East over the next 5 to 10 years?
Impossible to tell. The point is we're at the moment we are quite unsure about what's the Trump administration Iran policy, what's its China policy, right? We see tariffs at the beginning were for everyone. Now they seem to be particularly for China. Iran, maximum pressure, but then also letters exchanged and then again talks about disengagement from the region, but bombing against the Houthis. Very difficult to tell. I think also from Chinese side, they are very unsure, especially during the Biden administration. It was fairly easy to tell what the Americans wanted to do, right? So there was a real fear for a Middle East, Indo-East Asian kind of containment strategy, right? That was clear, and so the Chinese were gearing up for that. But now, who knows? So again, I think very likely in 5 or 10 years, in a way we can imagine that a lot of things might have changed. But I honestly remain skeptical. I don't think China's role in the region will radically change. There may be changes in its physical manifestations, like oil and gas, less important, but maybe trade over green tech or more advanced technologies will take its place, maybe.
But maybe the region will import from China.
Yes.
I think it will be even more trade imbalance.
Yes, exactly.
China.
So what I'm saying is that there will be some real changes in the manifestations of the relations, but I don't think there will be radical change in China's role in the region. I don't think they will take on the responsibility of rebuilding any order, really. I look at their proposal, the Global Security Initiative, the many 4, 5, 3, 6 points proposals for regional peace.
State building, no state building.
I think we will see these proposals coming again.
It's not working anyway, right?
No,
it hasn't really worked so far.
No, exactly. They constantly had this. It sometimes comes out in the Chinese debate when they talk about what they would hope for the region is to see strong institutions focused in which not necessarily democratic institutions, but strong state institutions that sideline religion, they focus on economic development, don't focus on regional rivalries. And this is what they would like to. This also means China would also not be that involved in really regional politics, just be a friend of everyone, trader with everyone, invest in everywhere, but not really involved in disputes, right? They don't want to see disputes.
But it's a non-real world.
Who knows, right?
The world is full of disputes, right? It's impossible.
Although I think in the Chinese debate, now it's difficult to tell, but especially over the past 5 years or so, I think there was also a stream of optimism as they saw that in reaction to the Arab Spring, certain countries like Egypt, but especially those in the Gulf, really shifted toward economic reconstruction. They say, this is what we want to say. And if you look at how they talk about Saudi Arabia or the UAE, they love it. They say, this is what Middle East leaders should do. Don't talk religion, talk business, diversification of the economy, trade, investment. We are here for you, right? This is really what. So, of course, it would be unrealistic.
Sanitized almost.
Yeah,
humanity,
exactly.
Right?
So I think it would be realistic to expect the entire region going through this process. But definitely, they hope that at least in some places in the region that will actually happen. And they will probably do their best to support us. Not in terms of diplomatic intervention, although I think willingness to, for example, be the host for Saudis and Iranians a few years ago, and also right immediately after the beginning of the war in Gaza, they were calling both sides to ensure that the relations remained intact between these two countries. So you can, and probably behind doors, they do check to keep the positive situation, maybe part a bit of pressure on both, just stay calm, right? But really, it's the economic side that probably they will take care of.
Thank you so much. Wonderful to have you here. We will follow your work. Is there any way to follow your work besides the MED initiative mentioned?
Yeah, well, of course, X. I'm active there, and Blue Sky. Yeah, on the ChinaMed Project, we have a website, www.chinamed.it. You can find all our work there. I have also my personal website. It's andreaghiselli.com. And that's it. You can send me emails if you want.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you so much.